There we go. Hello again, and thank you so much for joining Napa Book Mind this evening for what I know will be a very engaging conversation with author and renowned botanist Jake Ruygt. His book, A Flora of Napa County, compiles over 30 years of field research on the native plants found in Napa County, their indigenous uses, and scientific descriptions. Jake's aim is to inspire all individuals to learn about the unique and invaluable native environment and to share the botanical history of the Napa Valley with the next generation. This book includes historical information, species descriptions, beautiful colored plates, and added detailed botanical illustrations. It's a must-have complete reference book and field guide for anyone interested in exploring the native plants of Napa Valley. In a moment, Jake is going to tell us a little bit more about his background. I will just say that he is the leading authority on Napa County flora. With thousands of hours of field study, Jake has advanced the understanding of plant diversity and rare plant distribution, including the discovery of 2 new species. He's joined in conversation tonight with his daughter, author and illustrator Annie Ruygt, who has her own picture book, Sometimes It's Bright, which came out in April. And after a slide presentation and discussion, we'll be fielding those questions. So Jake and Annie, it's all yours.
Okay, well, welcome everybody and thanks for being here. And I'd like to start by saying thanks so much to, what happened?
Looks like the presentation.
Okay. All of a sudden my screen went crazy. All right, so anyway, yeah, thank you all for being here, and I want to thank the Book Mind for hosting this and for supporting this project. First off, I'd like to talk a little bit about my background. I was born in the Netherlands, and my family immigrated here in 1956 when I was 2 years old, just before I turned 3. And I grew up in Napa and attended schools locally and completed an AS degree at Napa Junior College, and went on to UC Davis, where I got a bachelor's degree in wildlife and fisheries biology. That was 1975. My goal was to work with animals, but somewhere along the way there, I got hooked on plants. My family's history is in horticulture and agriculture, and that gave me a lot of familiarity with plants. But my course of study at Davis included 2 botany classes, one in plant ecology and another in plant taxonomy. These inspired my study of the flora of Napa County and taught me how to preserve collected specimens for future study. I joined the California Native Plant Society in 1979 and started to make connections with amateur and professional botanists that helped me grow my knowledge and interest in the local flora. In 1987, I was contracted to complete my first botanical study as a professional. I started Napa Botanical Survey Services that year. This was part-time work for many years while I actually operated a landscape maintenance business, and that was my bread and butter up until 2.5 years ago. So the botanical work was part-time work for many years, and recently that's sort of grown. As I've retired, I've taken on more work. I received a landscape contractor's license in 1990, and now I'm partially retired from that. I continue my botanical consulting and work for mostly for the Land Trust of Napa County, which is has been a lot of fun because that's it's all positive work. It's not work that on properties that are slated to be developed. So one of the first things that people always ask me when they want to know about my book is how long does it take to write a flora. So I want to say that's a process, and I want to kind of go through that, how that came to be. During my 2 years, my years in Davis, I took the 2 classes, one in plant taxonomy, and that taught me how to collect and preserve specimens. And I began exploring as much of Napa County as I could. I always enjoyed hiking, so I thought I'd just go out and see what's out there. First, I spent a lot of time just driving along roadsides, and occasionally I'd hop a fence because something interesting was on the other side. I had a few places that were very hot spots locally that I enjoyed going to. One of them was actually south of Napa, near the old Napa Steel. I hiked into the parks in our area and onto public lands like Knoxville and Mount St. Helena. One of the photos here is me sitting on a rock overlooking Lake Berryessa. I started collecting and bringing home plant specimens in 1976. It's been a long time. So this was very helpful. Pressing plant specimens allowed me to look at them later for comparison with other things that I collected and to recheck my identifications. They are also vouchers, historic vouchers that I have donated, many have donated to local herbaria. At first, I put my accumulation of specimens into a cardboard box and wrote in all my information on 3x5 cards for each species. Over the years, I've collected over 7,200 herbarium specimens, and over 3,400 of them have now been donated to UC Berkeley and UC Davis. After a few years of collecting, I heard about the California Native Plant Society and joined, and I met people like Joe Calizzo and Richard Weston, who were making plant lists and working on a computer database with Gilbert Muth at Pacific Union College. They showed me a printout of their work and I talked them into acquiring a copy so that I could further that project. They had a list of 600 different plant species at the time that occurred in Napa County, and my goal was to see if I could find all of those species. It wasn't long before that they updated the version, and they came up with a list of 1,200 species. That pushed the bar out quite a bit further, but I wasn't daunted by that. I set a new goal and I was hooked. I started to find that there were other species out there that were not on the list, so I started to contribute information to that project. In 1985 and 86, Pacific Union College put out the last version of the computer printout that included over 1,700 entries and over 1,500 confirmed taxa. What you're looking at there is my first version of my computer database. Somewhere along the line, I hatched the idea of putting together a flora of my own. It was not until my wife and I purchased our first computer about 1990 that this seemed like a plausible idea. My wife, April, helped me design a database with 10 to 12 information fields. The first edition of this effort was completed in 1991-92. That's this, what you're looking at here. The fields that are in that version are still included in the final version of the flora. It's just been turned into a text format. With the publication of the Jepson Manual of Higher Plants of the University of California Press in 1993, there were many new taxonomic changes that came to light. So I was faced with reorganizing my document to include all of these changes. The changes affected about 25 or 30% of all the species that were in my flora project. In 1996, I printed out a second edition of that database. I believe that's what you're looking at. Yes, right there. That included 1,525 plant taxa. The taxa, I referred to taxa because that really refers to species and subspecies and varieties. Between 1993 and 2003, I took many rolls of slide photographs because I wanted to include photos and drawings in my book. With the intention was to use them in the book. Transferring slides into files for the book became a quality issue, so I purchased a digital camera in 2005 and began photographing all the plants again. I assembled a file of over 1,400 images, one per species, one choice image per species between 2005 and 2011. A few of my slides were used in a small book that I helped create. You may be familiar with this, a collaboration with Dr. Richard Lyon, 100 Napa County Roadside Wildflowers. This book was made by after Dr. Lyon, a retired urologist, showed up on my doorstep with this idea because he was fascinated by and wanted to learn about some of the local wildflowers. And this was put out within about a year's time. Mine was a little bit of a more lengthy process. Starting in 1996, I collected plant samples from the field and took them home to make simple pencil drawings of as many plants as I could. I often did 5 or 10 in a sitting. I had to come back to them later to add in ink. I later found that this delay in the process limited how much detail could be added in. I completed over 1,060 drawings by 2001, of which over 600 are included in the book. It was about 10 years into the project that I made an attempt to convert my database into a text-rich Word file. I started to write keys and began drafting introductory chapters for the book. This required a lot of research and assistance and review by other people. And many people were happy to help with that. It was a wonderful process. The first printed version of the Word file was in 2001, but the working copy did not include the introductory chapters, photos or illustrations. 4 copies of that were printed out and 2 were bound that were shared with CNPS friends. And they put this copy to the test in the field. They tested the plant keys and provided some valuable comments. After 2 years, an updated version was printed. During the course of this project, new species were continually being found in the field and had to be introduced into the text, with others that were dropped due to lack of good information or misidentifications. A third draft was printed in 2004 and 5. At this time, I started to create lists of questions so that I could systematically fill in my information gaps. As I found the answers to my questions, I would check them off the list and periodically create a new revised list. The goal was to shorten the list, but sometimes new questions arose. Some questions had to be answered by visiting herbaria that housed specific voucher specimens for Napa County. There was reports made by early collectors that showed up in the 1950s card file by Dr. Peter Raven that I tried to confirm. It was exciting to find and review some of those collections. I made a road trip to visit a number of collections in Southern California. I also contacted a number of taxonomic experts to get assistance in identifications and to send my collections to many of these. It was a real boon to my flora when the searchable database UC Consortium came online. With this, I could sit at my desk and work from home. It was not until 2010 that I had a version of my flora that I was ready to share and to solicit comments. This was a challenge to find people with knowledge and time to make appropriate comments. I solicited the help of 5 knowledgeable friends and associates and got help from 3 of them. And then in 2012, the Jepson manual was updated again. I had to make major revisions to my flora manuscript to introduce changes in plant families, genera, and species. Something I wasn't looking forward to, but it got done. This was a major setback, but in 2013-14, I was ready to look for a publisher. In 2014, I signed a contract with the California Native Plant Society to publish the book. I was both excited and relieved to get a publisher and professional help to shepherd my book to its final form. This was not exactly what followed, but in July 2015, I dropped off a digital copy of manuscript to the book to the designer Beth Hansen Winter near Portland, Oregon. I was not going to risk loss or damage in delivery, and it just happened that my wife had a family reunion a few hours drive from there that was happening in a couple of days. What came over the next few months was a process of negotiation about the book's content, who should be proofreading, and what form each file should be submitted in. The line drawings had to be digitized and reorganized. This was a large hurdle, but I was fortunate to have my daughter Andrea line up an artist, Jeff DeCourcy, to do this work. He was great to work with and very competent. Fundraising for the book was ongoing from 2013 to 2020. With the Napa Valley chapter of the CNPS taking on the main initiative of applying for grants from the Napa County Wildlife Commission and Community Valley, the Community Foundation, as well as donating from the chapter's fundraisers. There was also donations from the chapter's fundraisers and general funds. One of the last hurdles for the book was finding an affordable printer. and raising additional funds for printing. This was solved through help from my daughter Andrea again and donations that came from the Mead Foundation in Chipboro. The result, after 6 years waiting and revisions, the book was printed and received in November 2020. So now that pretty much covers it. I'd like to open up the session for questions.
Oh, me.
I was just about to say, Annie, if you stop the slide presentation, that would be awesome. And then Annie was going to ask a few questions first to get us started, and the rest I invite you to put your questions in the chat, and then I can call on you from there. And if you'd like to ask your question yourself, I think that'd be the most engaging way to do it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I'll just do a couple questions. So when you decided to create this flora, what was the process for you? Can you show us a little bit about like each step of kind of filing, gathering, pressing, filing the like one plant species? And did you have some formal training as a botanist at that point when you were starting this research?
So yeah, the only formal education I really had was the 2 courses at Davis. The rest of it is I've been self-taught. I think that's sort of something that kind of is expected from, in California's flora, it's so complex that you have to really teach yourself the local flora. You can go to anywhere in California and you've got to relearn quite a few plants. So it's a process, and something you have to develop an eye for is learning to identify the local plants. As far as the specimens, I think I've kind of covered that. If anybody has specific questions on the process, I think I've kind of gone through the process of how I assembled the book. I mean, I put through the chapters, and I sort of sent the different.
Here's a more specific question. Let's say like back in the 80s when you were going out and collecting these specimens, if you didn't know a plant at that point, what was the process like for you? How did you do your research?
Okay, so I would use the local floras. I would use the California floras. There's beginning with Munz and Keck. That was the flora that I was trained on back in college days. That was published in 1959. And then that wasn't until 1993 that the Jepson manual came out. So that was my primary resource, but I've also collected other floras. There's a Flora of the Pacific States, a 4-volume set that was very helpful. But if I couldn't come to a conclusion, and like I mentioned, once I collect things, if I couldn't come up with a decision on it, I would go back to it later. I would constantly re-looking at it. And even 5-10 years into, when I'd filed something away and I thought I had it right, I'd pull something out and realize I'd misidentified something. And that's why it was always helpful to have a file of herbarium specimens. But ultimately, if something seemed like it wasn't going to fit anywhere, I would try to find a taxonomic expert to come to a determination on that.
Yes, and that leads me to ask you about the species that you discovered, because as you told me, you had to get a review by a couple people.
Yes, yeah.
With them. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, so the trichostemma, I actually I ended up sending my specimens to a professor from Southern California. It was retired, and he had worked on that genus of plants when he was a grad student in the 1940s, and he looked at it and reviewed it, and he set up a sort of a research program for me to do to determine whether or not it was a valid taxon that needed to be described. So I did most of the field work, and unfortunately he was not physically able to come to Napa, but he ended up describing that plant.
Yeah, just a fun fact, I think we might have been on a trip to Disneyland when we were kids, and we stopped at his house, and I had no idea that I didn't know that my dad was discovering some new plant species, which is pretty cool. But we were, me and my sisters were just like, why are we here? What are they doing? And it was just a really wild yard with like all these interesting plants, but now I get it.
Well, the interesting thing that it was, I think I collected that specimen, the first specimen of that plant in 1979, and it wasn't until like 2003 that it was described. So
yeah,
long process, and it's a long story in itself.
Yeah. Can you give us a quick lesson on how to keep plants and like basically use your flora if I were out looking at plants and I wanted to identify them?
Okay, so one of the goals I had in the design of my flora was to make it usable for people that are amateurs and professionals. So for the amateur, I think the drawings and photographs are very useful, and you may start there to sort of get yourself generally situated as to what you're looking at. But for the professional, and I think I made a little bit of an assumption in not having a key to get you into the fern or the conifer or the flowering plant groups. You have to sort of start with one of those keys and go down through the key. The process of using the key, they're called binomial keys, and you're making a choice first between, let's say if you're on page 79, you're looking at A1 versus A2. You read A1 and you say, okay, on page 79, it says plants aquatic, submerged, floating, or as water dries up on mud. And then choice A2 is plants not aquatic, some of wet places. So you have to make a decision there, and you may not be absolutely secure by that. And if you're not, then go through both sides. But if you're secure, then you go on to the next one and you follow down through that same process. You go to B3 or B4 if you choose A2 above it. And then if you've made a decision there, then you go on to the line C and then D, and then until you get to the family. And once you've gotten the family, then you've got to go to the page for the families. And there's a quick, at the back inside of the book, there is a key to an index to the plant families in the page that you can find that on. So then when you get to the plant family, you probably have to go through additional keys. So that's why I think, that may be daunting for a lot of people, but I think you can simplify that if you can quickly find in the back in the photograph or illustration what genus or family you're in.
Yeah, I think your photo references and your illustrations are really helpful, especially like I'm a visual learner, and they're very clear, beautiful photos. So cool. Well, I have one more question, then we'll open it up to anyone who has a question. My last question is, how has the vegetation in Napa changed over the 43 years that you've been collecting specimens? I'm curious what you've seen.
Yeah, that's sort of a sad story, let me tell you. I always hope that I wish that I had been around another 10 or 20 years earlier, because there were a lot of things that had already disappeared. But it's been a story of disappearing. There's not only because of areas that have been developed, but just because of invasive plants. For a while there, I would say that it was really development that was taking the largest chunk of our landscape and converting it into something that was, was eliminating native plants. But now invasive plants are pretty much choking out a lot of our natives. So it's very common to come in an area and you'll still find most of the species, but the level of occurrence is usually, less than 5 or 10% of the entire population of plants that are out there. We probably have lost a few of these species over the years, but there are a lot of them that are now at risk. And yeah, it's really a challenge to figure out how we're going to deal with this.
Okay, well, I'm curious about that, but I do want to open it up to other people who have questions.
And I'm going to suggest, since I don't see questions in the chat, that you just raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we'll try it that way. Is anyone ready to pose a question? Anyone?
See a hand from Ken.
There you go. Come on in.
Go for it, Ken.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, first, congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you.
As I know, it was a long time coming. And I've got a two-part question.
Okay.
First, are you worried about what the fires are doing to Napa County insofar as species not coming back, being so devastated that they may not come back? And two, I noticed that on my drive back today from Santa Rosa, a lot of the pine forests look pretty devastated, but the oaks are coming back pretty good. And does this mean that the oaks could take over habitat of the pine, where the pine forests were in the future?
Well, actually, what's interesting is the pines, for the most part, are what they call obligate cedars. So they won't come back from the trees themselves as standing trees, but they'll come back from seedlings. But they depend on adequate rainfall, and we're not really getting a lot of rainfall. So that's a key right there, is whether or not, if we get enough rainfall, the seeds will germinate. They're usually sitting in the soil for many years, and they're waiting for the opportunity to regenerate. You generally don't find too many seedlings of those species if there isn't a fire. Now, this is also true for a lot of our shrubs, and especially like ceanothus. I don't know if you're familiar with ceanothus, but
I am, yeah.
They're obligate cedars, or fire dependent, in another way of saying it. So they may just, a lot of them are, few and far between in a mature plant community. And after a fire, it's amazing to see they actually temporarily become dominants in a lot of these plant communities. And slowly they get choked out by the plants that they compete with. But all of them depend on a certain period of time to mature to produce flower and fruit. If they don't get those numbers of years, and they don't produce enough fruit to sit in the ground in the seed bank, when the next fire comes, then we're going to lose them. And that's sort of happened in a couple of places. We've had the Napa ceanothus, or Napa hollyleaf ceanothus is called, has burned twice within the last 3 years. And it's one that takes 3 years before it starts to flower. So I think we're going to lose a little bit of habitat as a result of that.
Good question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just quickly, we'll go to Cindy next, but I want to ask from the chat, from Tara, is Newell open space included? What changes have you seen before or after fires? But I think you've answered that, unless it's specifically about Newell.
Okay, so I can go?
Unless you wanted to, Jake, did you want to answer Tara's question? Is the Newell open space included in your book?
It is, yeah. If you if you look at, if you've got a copy of the book, there are one of the last entries at the bottom of each, one of the last fields in the bottom of each entry includes coded letters like Bothe and Sky for Skyline. And let's see, I don't think Newell's in there, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, I don't think it was at the time that I see a lot of this I completed around 2000, 2005 already. So Newell was not open to the public yet. And the other thing is, I think I used Los Posados in here, and it's sort of closed now. So things do change.
Cindy, yes.
Okay, well, I did buy your book, and it's absolutely terrific. Everyone who is interested in the environment in the Napa Valley should own the book. And I look forward to your talk at Master Gardeners this coming Thursday. Yes, and now let's talk. I have a weakness for invasive plants because they're easy to grow. Like I've got a passion flower and that sort of thing. Are there certain? But I love native plants, and at the CNIPS plant sale, I bought a Mexican marigold, which is almost native. It originally came from Mexico, and it is amazing. It needs no water, attracts all kinds of pollinators. It gets no care. It's at least 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide, and it's a beautiful plant. And I even like the scent. But are there invasive plants that we really should not plant in our yard? Like, what do you think of Buddleia, for example?
Well, I think Buddleia is in my book, but over the years, I've only seen it growing in 2 places and only a few plants. and I don't think it really self-sows. It doesn't volunteer too readily. So,
Good.
but I would keep an eye on that plant, your marigold, because if it does so well in this dry climate, if it starts to self-sow, you might be concerned because it may not appear to be spreading from your yard, but birds may be carrying the seeds elsewhere, and that's something that's always a risk. Birds are amazing in distributing seeds.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's something that they need to carefully do is the nursery trades need to go through a little more carefully and review some of these new plant introductions that are meant to fit into our xeriscapes, because they do have that risk of escaping into the wildlands, and that varies in different parts of California.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Tara has another part to her question. She's asking if they order the book tonight through the Bookmine, if they are signed copies. And if they're not, we could probably arrange to make that happen. I see Paul tonight. We could probably make that happen. So if they come by the book.
Yeah, we can make that happen.
Great.
I mean, if Jake wants to.
If Jake agrees.
I won't forge his signature.
We might. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Is that
Steve Rasmussen here? Steve Rasmussen.
Hi, Steve. Go for it.
Hi. Hi, Jake.
Hi.
Jake, I live up in Calistoga, and I'm working on various grants with the Napa County RCD. And one of them that they have is to help restore monarch habitat. And so in October and November, through this grant, they're going to provide me with about 175 California native plants for planting on my property that are butterfly and pollinator friendly. One of the plants that they're kind of featuring is milkweed. And actually they were just looking this week for volunteers. I didn't fit the bill, and I'll explain why, to actually attempt seeding by drone. They're going to attempt to seed multi-acre plots with milkweed by drone. I recused myself. I said I didn't want to do that because I have a goat herd that is now working clearing brush on my property, and milkweed is toxic to goats. So I don't want to, even though it's great for butterflies, it's not good for goats. So the two questions are, do you know anything more about goats and milkweed, number one? And number two, what do you think of the idea of sort of dispersing milkweed by drone, seeds by drone, to cover sort of wide areas? And what does that do to the sort of balance of species that might be in an affected area?
Well, that's sort of a loaded question, really, because you're voluntarily dropping seeds into other people's property. But and the other thing is, where's that seed coming from? There's always been, years ago, there are people that talked about mixing different DNA with existing populations and what that does to the existing populations when they start to hybridize. So I would really be concerned about where that seed's coming from that they're using, for one thing. I mean, it seems like a great way to reintroduce the plants, but I think there's definitely some potential side effects to that.
I'll ask about that. They're not dropping on other people's property. They're looking for volunteers who have 2 acres and who have large parcels and would drop it on their own property. Do you know anything about milkweed and goats? Do you know anything, whether I'm right that I mean, that's why I just read on the internet that you shouldn't let your goats get around milkweed.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know if they're how toxic it is to them. I mean, some animals, they can taste the chemicals in the plant, and they'll ignore it if they know it's bad for them. So, right. But I don't know. I can't really.
So up here, we're right below the Palisades Trail, and after the '64 fire, neighbors who were up here then told me that a lot of the knobcone pines that are in the hills behind us were dispersed by airplane. They actually reseeded the fire area with knobcone pines, dropping cones by airplane. Do you know anything about that at all?
You know, I've heard about that, but I've never been able to find any proof of that. And I've asked around a little bit, and nobody's been able to come up with that kind of information to confirm.
I'm going to pause, Steve, for a moment and go to Kurt, who has a question. And then I have one in the chat that I'll ask after that.
Okay, hi, I'm Kurt Ritchie. I have a question about, somebody mentioned invasive species and the fact that nurseries will sell them. I think the one that really frosts me is the Scotch broom. I see nurseries in California. I'm not sure if in Napa they do, but I see a number of nurseries in California selling Scotch broom, and it's just so invasive and just takes over so much.
Right,
But
right.
is there any, is the Native Plant Society lobbied to try to limit some of those kind of things?
You know, I think the Native Plant Society at the state level, they have people that are, yeah, they have lobbyists that have worked on that side of sort of problems. But locally, no, we haven't really tried to attack that. I think that actually the city water department, they've put out some brochures on invasive plants. So there's a little bit of that information out there, but I think that it's something that would be very useful to have, that people could go onto a website and get more information on plants that are locally invasive that might be sold in the nurseries.
Yeah, I'm thinking even a Native Plant Society committee that goes around to nurseries, you know, searches out these kind of things and talks to people. Because I mean, I would think that, you know, everybody, it's a business, right? They want to sell things. But on the same token, you would think that if you really pointed out how invasive some of this stuff is, that they might talk to people and might actually change their mind on selling it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll see if I can get
The city
involved.
has had a program of planting privet trees for many years. They don't plant them anymore, but those privets are now starting to show up in our riparian areas.
Like the vinca.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'll think about getting in the native the local chapter here and talking to people about that. See if we can get a committee together.
So from the chat again, Carol Pull is from the Napa Wildlife Rescue, and she says they have 2-acre property in the Caneros, and they would like to gradually transition the property to California natives, primarily plants that feed wildlife. Any suggestions to who could help make a plan for that?
Wow, that's
a big question.
Yeah, I mean, we sell a lot of natives, you know, and so that's a good resource. The Native Plant Society has a couple of sales per year that provide local natives that are appropriate locally. But some of the things that you may want to introduce for wildlife friendly may not be the things that are necessarily ornamental. If you're out in the Carneros area, actually, the milkweed might be a good plant to plant. And
asking about that is Mary. Where do you get the seeds? Is it just from the existing plants in the?
Yeah, there's pods. You could probably collect from pods that are, you know, if you have access to local plants, you could probably collect some of those seeds. But
I haven't seen many locally.
Henny knows anything about that, sources for it.
And I have Henny telling everyone the next native plant sale is scheduled for October 9th and 10th at Skyline. Thank you. Have I missed anyone? Let's see. Let me make sure. Anyone waving at me that wants to ask a question at this point?
There was a question from Henny earlier about native and non-native plants, if they're in your book. Do you have only native plants, or do you have kind of a mix of both?
Okay, that's a good question. So what I tried to cover was all the plants that are native or naturalized, which means plants that volunteer, that can reproduce in the wild. So I've fudged that a little bit by including some common landscape weeds, because I'm a landscaper. So things that you might find in your garden might also be in the book.
Great. I have one more question for Jake. If I can keep asking questions.
Yeah. Go.
I wanted to know what you're working on right now, if there's anything interesting you'd like to share, like as far as botany goes or even personal.
Well, I've been thinking about doing something, maybe writing a paper on the post-fire effects on native plants. It's sort of interesting how the plants sort of fall into 4 categories, maybe 5 categories. But you have these plants that only come up after a fire, and they're only seen for a year or 2, maybe 3 years. There's a few shrubs that last longer than that, but then they disappear again, and you don't see them at all. You don't know that those plants are there in the seed bank. So that's one group. And then you have another whole group of plants that are opportunists. After a fire, they come up in abundance, and there might be a few of them around, but they just like, especially a lot of the bulb species will come up and flower abundantly after a fire. So this, and as I mentioned, the fire dependent shrubs, that's another group. So I just think that's sort of an interesting thing to sort of compile information on those things and possibly publish an article about it.
I have other than my raising a child that's 41 years old, I can't imagine investing so much time and energy into something and then completing it. I mean, what does that feel like to actually have it published and sitting in our bookstore?
Yeah, what a relief. Let me tell you.
Really? Does it feel?
5.5 years, that between dropping off the manuscript and actually getting it published, it was quite a relief to actually finally get it done. And yeah, I feel like, that's a contribution I can be proud of.
Very much so, but it must have freed up a little bit of time in your life to have.
Oh yeah, now I'm out bird watching.
Are you categorizing?
I'm not categorizing, but I'm making lists.
Drawing pictures.
Oh, he's an avid birder, and he logs all of his birding outings on eBird, and this man loves collecting data. So.
Yeah. I've worked on mushrooms some, but the sad thing about mushrooms is since we haven't had much rain, there aren't many mushrooms around. So that concerns me because mushrooms are actually important parts of the ecosystem of many plants' roots. They're usually attached to a lot of plants, and they may actually interconnect between trees or shrubs. So they transfer chemicals, complex carbohydrates and things between trees and shrubs. So if we don't have those mycorrhizal connections, then that can further debilitate our forests and chaparral.
In your time in Napa, have you ever seen it looking this dry before?
Never. No, there's a lot of places I've been to, like Etiquera Creek is completely dry this year. There's a wetland in Pope Valley that I've never seen dry, and it's getting overgrown with all kinds of different non-native weeds. So I don't know if that's just a couple of years drought, or if it's a longer term thing that's sort of a net effect of having periodic drought.
Tara, you're asking, do you see pipe vine very often?
Pipe vine. Well, there's some places where it grows abundantly, but it's not very common in the county. It grows in a lot of different habitats, in riparian and in forest. I've seen it even in some bald grassland on hilltops, curious places for it, but yeah, mostly in riparian places.
I have a question.
Yeah,
if that's okay.
Yes.
Another question. I'm Felicia, my wife and I, bucket list is to make a foraged gin from the back of our property, which is up under the Palisades, along the Palisades Trail. And in your book, you referenced that there was California juniper up there. All of that area burned in this fire.
Right.
We didn't find the California juniper before the fire. And so my question is, how many years do you think I'm gonna have to wait before I can search for California juniper up in that property, or might it have survived the fire?
You know, I haven't been up in that area, but I would say if it did burn, it's probably going to take 5 to 10 years before it recovers to a point where it's producing any kind of fruit.
Okay. Is it, you know, you don't mention, I mean, it's not very, you mentioned it's not very common in the county, but it's there. And I think you mentioned that up in that area, you've seen it. How scarce is it in the county?
Well, I think there's only maybe 5 locations for it. I've seen a single tree out north of Snell Valley, if you know where that's at.
Mm.
Berryessa Estates area, and then there was maybe 10 plants up on the ridge behind your property, what you're talking about, at the very top of the ridge, near what's called Little Bear Valley. And then
That's the area up above us, Little Bear Valley above us.
Yeah, up in the behind the Palisades.
Okay.
And then there was I've seen a stand of maybe 30 or 40 trees up on the ridge line near Berryessa Peak, and maybe a few isolated plants, but that's about it. And then there's a couple of records of locations I've never seen.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
You know, I think we're sort of at the northern limit of its range.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
You're muted, Karen.
Oh, there you go. Sorry, Addison, I will ask for you. Do you have a favorite taxa and region habitat in Napa from doing your research? Great question. Yeah, where are you drawn back to after all these years?
Taxa, I don't know about a specific one, but I really enjoy a lot of the plants in the phlox family. The Linanthus or Hesperline or Leptosiphon and Navaretia. I enjoy those genera.
And where would you go to find them in Napa?
They're mostly in woodlands and grasslands. They're annuals. They're just there's quite a variety of them in Napa County, and I think they're, you know, they have little clusters of flowers, and they're beautiful. And a lot of times they grow in sort of in mass, so they create patches of one color. So yeah. Other than that, the lilies, I mean, that's an obvious favorite for everybody, right? So Fritillaria and Lilium, and you know, the fawn lily, which is on my shirt. You can see that.
Now I have from Christine, does the native plant garden resemble the natural setting in Napa? Does that question make sense? Yep.
Talking about the Martha Walker Garden.
I believe so.
I think the Martha Walker Garden is attempted to sort of include plants from throughout California. So, but they did try to, you know, originally there was attempts made to set it up as sort of woodland area, grassland area. So there's sort of habitat types that have been included, which can be found in Napa County. But specifically, I don't think there's a Napa County native plant area within the garden.
And Cindy is recommending that everyone take a walk there, especially in the spring. It's up at Skyline. I'd go like this if you've already done that.
Beautiful. And it's a great way to learn about the native plants if you're new.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk to the people there that can help you on, you know, how to take care of the native plants.
Mm-hmm. So what's next? What, other than coming down and signing some books?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's next, Jake?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always work, you know, I've got lots of projects going on through the Napa Land Trust.
Can you be specific about any of them?
A lot of that has had to do with the fires and the effects of fires, and a few of them have been monitoring trees and how they survived. It's unfortunate. A lot of the blue oaks, the way they burned in the latest fires, there are instances where the canopy still has singed leaves hanging on them a year later, but the trunks are completely hollowed out underneath, so they topple over and they're gone. They're completely gone. They're not resprouting.
Oh.
So will they come back? Is it going to be different? You know, 10 years from now, that's what we're going to try to figure out. We may have to do some replanting in some areas that were burned so severely. other areas I can see seedlings coming up. So I think, I'm hopeful.
You work with any of the city departments or the counties when you're trying to do the restoration in some of those large watershed areas?
I've worked with some, well, there's a vineyard company south of town that as mitigation, has had to do some restoration along a creek. So I've been involved with that for quite a few years now, trying to draw up plans of what to plant and where to improve the quality along the stream and to remove some of the invasives. Other than that, I haven't done too much, not with the city. I do work with the regional parks on some of their projects that I do some inventories and assessments before they do any plans on how they may make improvements to those parks.
I see a question that Andrea's answered, and I'm wondering if looks like we have time for a couple more questions. Is anybody?
Tara asks, can they contact you, Jake, if they have more questions?
Oh, sure, yeah. You can send me an email. I can give you my email. It's
I'll type it. Yeah.
Okay.
Type it in? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always open to people send me, if you have a photograph of a plant you want to identify, if you've got a good picture that has the leaves and the flowers, then I generally can give you an answer on that. Or if you have questions about invasive plants, I'm glad to answer what I can.
Is there one plant we should absolutely never plant? Cindy's asking that excellent question.
I'm fearful.
I think we all are tonight.
Yeah, well, I don't know. There's pampas grass was one that was sold pretty frequently at a lot of the nurseries, and I don't see it sold much anymore. And I think that they've kind of eliminated they've kind of sterilized the plants so that they can't produce viable seed. So I don't know. I would still be careful of that.
Tara's adding bamboo.
Well, bamboo is only, it's invasive, but it throws out runners and continues expanding, but it's not like something that reseeds, it self-sows. So
Kurt is adding Scotch broom.
Yeah, well, actually Scotch broom doesn't occur in Napa County. It grows on the coast. We have French broom, which is a real problem. Lots of places. It's very closely related to Scotch broom. And for a while they were selling that at the nursery, but I don't think they do anymore.
Mary is asking oleander with a question mark.
Oleander is somewhat invasive. I find it on roadside ditches, and I've seen it along the margin of Lake Berryessa.
Yeah, that's where I've seen it.
Yeah, but not too many places. But yeah, it does have the potential to be invasive.
And Henny is asking tree of heaven.
Yeah, don't plant that.
Tell me why.
Available, but yeah. Some of the acacias are fairly invasive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think
Any
Henny
last
had a question. Her hand was raised.
Where's that? Go for it.
I just have a comment to make to let everyone know that we work in the native plant garden on Wednesday mornings from 9 to noon. So anyone who would like to come and ask questions for those of us who are working in the garden or would like to join us and learn about native plants, that's a good place to start. And it's in Skyline Park, and we're there every Wednesday morning.
What were the times again?
9 to noon on Wednesday morning. And we welcome all volunteers.
I have one last question. We have almond trees that, that are seemingly wild that grow along the creek through our property. Are those escapees from somebody's, almond field years and years ago, or are they in fact native to this area?
No, they're not native. Yeah, there are some almonds in the valley that have naturalized or they're long-term survival. The sour cherry, that's a little bit more invasive. That's in a lot of creeks, and I don't know if people still plant that, but it's sort of, I think it was used as a root stock for some of the other fruit crops. That's closely related to the almond.
And the plums would be the same thing, the wild plums.
We call them cherry plums, but yeah, sour cherry, yeah.
We probably have time for one final question tonight. Anyone have one? Oh,
no.
Yes. How do you differentiate between native and non-native blackberry?
Okay. Well, the native blackberry has a fine sort of a prickle-like thorn instead of a real stout thorn. That's one of the main ways to identify it. The native has sort of a grayish bloom, they call it, on the stem, whereas the Himalayan blackberry is sort of purplish or reddish on the stem. But those really stout thorns on the Himalayan blackberry is sort of the key. Also, the number of leaflets on the native tend to be 3, and the Himalayan tends to be 5. We have a couple other non-native blackberries as well, but they're not nearly as common. So those are the two: the native California blackberry and the Himalayan blackberry, which, by the way, is extremely invasive.
Wow, this has been amazing just to witness a passion come to life and such a longevity. It wasn't something you just whipped out. And I appreciate getting to know you and your effort to bring this to all of us here in Napa. Paul, are you still listening? Could you take a second and let people know what happens? So if they want to purchase the book, they do it through our website, and then how will it happen that we get them autographed before they pick them up? Or
yeah, whoever wants to order one, just go to napabookmine.com. It's pretty easy. There's a bar at the top where you can put in his book. I know there was a link dropped way up in the chat to the specific book. And in terms of getting it signed, essentially, if we have a group of books that want to be signed, we'll reach out to Jake and hook them down at his convenience. If you want them penned to a specific person or you want your name involved, include that in the note, and we'll make sure you get it. It would be just, the timing would depend on Jake's schedule and how much we're trickling in, but yeah, we'll make sure it happens.
And there's the link again to the book. Thank you so much. And in a couple of days, a link to this chat will be on our YouTube channel, and you can find it on our website as well. Nice to meet everyone, and I hope we see you again.
Thank you, Bookmine.
Take care.
Good night.